disconnected and connected entities. An entity is connected if it's added within the context, otherwise it's disconnected. Let's see what we mean by that. In this case, we're adding a student within the context, as usual, as we have seen before. But when we add it outside the context, it's what is known as disconnected. So this addition would have been connected, and this one is disconnected. So it just depends on whether it's inside or outside that context. Let's just remind ourselves how that works by the usual adding within the context. So if I were to run that, and I start off with my table, so that if we have our table, simple table, and then we want to just add a new student to it, this is going on within the context, in other words, in a connected situation. So if you run that and refresh our table, we should see that Rob has been added. Now this is just a normal situation in a connected scenario. Why do we say it's connected? Well, notice how we're using the context here. Let's take a look at that context, which is this file up here, and take a look, and you can see that what we're doing is adding our connection string, which is connected to this particular database. So you can see that that's what the context does. It provides a connection to the database, so that when we are adding within that context, and it's in a connected situation. Let me just delete that data for the moment, so that we've got just the 3 entries. So what are we going to do? What we're going to do is to try and add this entry in a disconnected situation. In other words, outside that context. So what are we going to have to do? Well, what we're going to have to do is to tell the context that we need to enter this data. And the way to do that, Entity Framework Core enables us to notify the context of the state of that entity. And that's how we go about it in Entity Framework Core. So we use this notify that it's to be added. We can also notify that it's to be deleted and modified, and we'll come to those later. But that's the general idea then. If you're adding something externally, and by the way, this is more applicable when we have a web application. When we have web, we need to add our data externally in the client-server situation, but we'll come back to that. So where we'll be using adding data in a disconnected situation. So this is the main thing we need to do. We need to indicate to the context that it is to be added, so that now if I were to run that and refresh our table, we'll see that Rob has indeed been added. So from a disconnected situation, we've notified the context that it's to be added, and then when we come to do the save changes, then it will be added as a new entry. So we've learned how to add our entry, so let's just replace this with what we're going to do is to modify an entry and make sure that ID exists before we go any further. And yes, it does. ID 1 exists. Now what about, how do we notify the context that we're going to, that it is to be modified? Well, that's how we do it. So we therefore will run that, and that should therefore modify the first entry. So once again, we've got a disconnected situation, and we're telling the context that it is to be modified. So when we refresh the table, we can see that the first name has been changed. And what about deleting a student in the disconnected situation? So once again, being disconnected, being outside the context, all we need to do is to notify that it is to be deleted, And then if we were to run that and then refresh our table, you can see the first entry has indeed been deleted. So to summarize what we've been doing, we've been making changes outside the context, and then if we do that, it's in a disconnected situation, and then we can we need to notify the context of what it needs to do with that, because we say now that the context is tracking. Keep an eye out for that word. The context is now tracking that particular entry. Previously it didn't know anything about it, and now because you've told it it's an entity which is to be deleted, it is now tracking that entity. Incidentally, it might be an idea to use the change tracker to indicate the state of the object. We could indicate the state of the object before and after. So if we were to run that, well, we'd better make sure that we're deleting, we'll delete element 2 here, otherwise it would have caused an error. So let's just run that and see if it will indicate the state before and after to us as well. So if we refresh our table, we'll find that element 2 has been, but more importantly what we're talking about is that it's indicating it was detached, and now it's in the deleted state. So here we're saying it's detached, and down here we're saying it's deleted.